is a case about a serial killer that I've never heard of before, and I'm curious to know if you have as well. Tonight's case is about the collector. In 1988, a lot of folks in the Westport neighborhood of Kansas City, Missouri, knew a man named Robert Berdella. He was a bit of an oddball. He ran a flea market booth called Bob's Bazaar, where he sold unusual antiques with a distinctly dark or occult theme. But in this part of town, it wasn't really that shocking. In fact, he seemed to fit right into the eclectic community. He made it his home, and this was something that couldn't be said for his hometown in Ohio. As a kid, Bob was a quiet loner. He wore thick glasses and suffered from high blood pressure, which made him a target of bullies. But in his uneventful, albeit lonely life, it took a turn when he was 16. That year, he saw a movie that reportedly would change his life forever. The Collector, based on a novel of the same name by John Fowles. The novel that inspired serial killers Leonard Lake and Christopher Wilder. But even worse, on Christmas Day, Bob's father died at the age of 39. This absolutely devastated him, and much to his disapproval, his mother remarried, and Bob could barely contain the disdain of his stepfather. It was during this time that he became interested in art. The weirder, the better. His interest and emerging talent earned him a partial scholarship to the Kansas City Art Institute. So in 1967, he packed up and moved to Kansas City to begin his studies. He also began a popular extracurricular activity, using and selling drugs. In 1968, he was busted for selling methamphetamines to an undercover agent. He pled guilty, received a fine, and a 5-year suspended sentence. But only a month later, he was caught with marijuana and LSD and spent 5 days in jail. But those charges were dropped for lack of evidence. Regardless of this, the Art Institute wanted him out. Drug charges are one thing. It's the 60s. Drug use on an art campus was pretty common. But Robert's art had become increasingly disturbing. At 3 different performances, and I could not believe this, he had killed animals, including a dog, on stage. What? In 1969, he was forced out of the Kansas City Art Institute. He, however, chose to remain in Kansas City. He bought a modest 3-story house on Charlotte Street. Again, like I said, the eclectic Westport neighborhood suited his personality, and they were welcome to anyone, people, any of their neighbor. They didn't care if you dated a man, if you dated a woman. They didn't care. Everybody was welcome, which I appreciate because it's horrible. Anyway, Bob worked as a cook, and he ran his curio shop out of the Westport flea market, and he volunteered with the community. never seen alive. A couple months later, in June of 1985, a young man named Mark Wallace ducked into Berdella's garage to get out of an oncoming sudden thunderstorm. These two had met previously when Wallace had done some yard work for Robert. Robert invited the 20-year-old into his house, and he was never seen again. In late September, another one of his old boarders, a man named Jim Ferris, called him looking for a place to stay. Robert obliged him, and Jim disappeared. However, unlike Robert Shelton and Mark Wallace, Jim, his family started looking. His disappearance was reported to the police. Another one of Robert's former boarders, a drug addict named Todd Stoops, told the police that both of these men had last been seen with Robert Berdella. When he was questioned by police, he said, "Yeah, I knew both of them. No, I haven't seen them in a while. He dropped Jerry off at the dance and hadn't seen him since." He was pretty indignant about being questioned and started to refuse to answer any other questions without a lawyer. When the police put him under surveillance, he threatened them with a harassment suit. With no more evidence, the cases went cold, and just to be safe, police told Stoops that he shouldn't go to Robert Berdella's house anymore. Then, in June of 1986, Stoops runs into Robert at a local park. He must have lost his mind because he went with Robert after he invited him home for lunch and possibly, a little action. He accepted and became one more young man to drop off the face of the earth. In the spring of 1987, Robert makes a new friend. Larry Wayne Pearson wandered into Robert's shop, and he expressed an interest in witchcraft and the occult. The two became friends, and Pearson moved in with Berdella. He worked off his rent by doing chores around the house and helping at the shop. However, Pearson couldn't stay out of trouble, and he was arrested for petty theft. Robert bailed him out, and Pearson was never heard from again. Are you sensing a theme here? Other than Howell and Ferris, none of these men were reported missing. But among the transients, sex workers, and the underground community in general, their absence was noticed. Rumors began swirling about Robert Berdella. Several sex workers had gone to his house. Told others that he was a mean partner. He tied them up. He injected them with drugs. He inflicted pain through various cruel methods. And some of these workers claimed that they had seen some of these missing men's belongings in his house. But probably being afraid of being arrested themselves, none of them went to the police. This brings us to April 2nd, 1988. A meter reader working on Charlotte Street saw something pretty shocking. A naked man leapt out of a second-story window. This man, Chris Bryson, ran to a neighbor's house. He was bruised, bloody, and he had a dog collar around his neck. His eyes were red and swollen, and he didn't seem as though he could see very well. The neighbors, of course, called the Kansas City Police Department, and when they arrived, Mr. Bryson told them a tale they could hardly believe. He said he'd been hitchhiking near the Greyhound bus station when a man in a brown Toyota Tercel picked him up and offered to take him to a party. Later, he would admit that he was engaging in sex work, and the man had picked him up for a date. He accepted, and he went with the man to his house at 4315 Charlotte Street. He said the man, who had introduced himself as Bob, told him to go upstairs away from his two dogs. was knocked unconscious. He said when he woke up, he was chained up in the basement. And over the next 4 days, Bob would sexually assault him repeatedly. He beat him with a metal pole. He electrocuted him and injected him with sedatives. What? What? Bryson said that when he screamed, Bob would inject drain cleaner into his throat. He also put something like alcohol or ammonia in his eyes, which is absolutely, that makes me want to yell. It's not even my eyes. Bryson said Bob had shown him the Polaroid pictures of prior men who appeared to be deceased, and he told him that if he didn't cooperate, that he would end up in the trash, just like them. After the first couple of days, Bryson gained Bob's trust, and Bob took him upstairs and tied him up there. The assault and torture continued, though, but in between, Bryson was now allowed to watch TV and have his hands tied in front of him rather than above him. On the 4th day, when Bryson thought that his captor had left the house, he noticed a book of matches on the floor nearby. He used these to burn through his ropes. Unsure if Bob was home or not, he thought that his only chance of escape was through the window. He leapt through the glass, cutting himself and breaking a bone in his foot when he landed. Seeing this man's condition, police had every reason to believe his story, so they took him to the hospital and waited for Bob to come home. When he got home and saw the police at his house, he seemed surprised. He was arrested, but refused to let them search his house, so they got a warrant, of course. When they tried to enter, they were greeted by 2 very angry chow-chows. Once Animal Service had gotten the dogs away safely, the police entered the home. Immediately, they knew that searching this house would be an incredible challenge. It was stacked floor to ceiling with boxes, magazines, and just strange, random items. And on top of that, there was dog hair and feces everywhere. Ugh. Yuck. In the 2nd floor bedroom, they found evidence of cooperation with Chris Bryson's report. A blood-stained bed with burnt ropes. Next to the bed were a metal pole, a tray of needles, swabs, and eyedroppers. On the floor nearby was an electrical transformer with clamps on the ends of its wires. But that's not all they found. Luminol test showed massive amounts of blood, especially in the basement and in the bathtub. Just as Bryson had said, there was a stash of more than 350 Polaroids showing men in various stages of torture and sexual assault, some of them appearing to already be deceased. Among this clutter, they found 2 skulls, an envelope full of teeth, and what looked like some vertebrae. The skulls were analyzed. One was determined to be a high-quality fake, much like Bob would sell at his store. But the other was very real and belonged to a young man who had died about a year ago. Dental records would show that it belonged to Robert Sheldon. The vertebrae had been cut with a hacksaw and a knife, as though someone had decapitated the victim. And indeed, the police found a hacksaw, a miter saw, and a chainsaw on the property. The chainsaw had blood and human hair on it. Now, with the evidence that the murders had taken place at Robert's home, the police got a warrant to dig up the property. And in the backyard, they found another skull and a small bone fragment. This skull would later be identified as He confessed to the murders of 6 men, all between the ages of 18 and 21, beginning in 1984. In each confession, he gave the details of how he'd lured them in. The exact methods of torture he used differed, but overall, the modus operandi was the same. Once they were in his house, he would drug them, knock them out, and tie them up. He would, over the course of hours or days or whatever made him happy, repeatedly sexually assault them and torture them, much as he had done to Chris Bryson. Some of them died from his abuse. Some of them he killed by suffocation with a plastic bag or a garrote. Once his victims were deceased, he would horse them over a spot in the basement or the bathtub and drain them of their blood. When that was done, he would dismember them with various instruments, including the saws that were seized by police. He would put them in plastic bags and put them out with the garbage. He was sentenced to 2 life sentences with no possibility of parole. While incarcerated, he rallied against the media for dehumanizing him, saying he was a really good person. He'd just made some mistakes. He also filed several suits against the prison for mistreatment. From behind bars, and I'm amazed at this, he managed to sell his massive hoard in a series of auctions. The appraiser in charge of it all called it a mind-boggling accumulation of 2,000 rare antiquities, ordinary household goods, and an uncountable assortment of junk. The bulk of the estate, including the house on Charlotte Street, was purchased by a flamboyant former bank robber, and multi-millionaire industrialist Del Dunmere, who had it demolished. In the fall of 1992, Robert Berdella wrote to a minister who had befriended him. He complained that the prison officials were not giving him his heart medicine. And then on October 8th, 1992, at the age of 43, Robert Berdella suffered a heart attack and died. He had served less than 4 years of his sentence. Anyway, thank you guys so much for watching. I will catch you next time for another true crime video. I don't really have any words for this one, except what a creep. Oh, it gives me the heaps. Have you heard of this guy before?